Well, thank you, Ben, for those very, very kind remarks. Thank you for having me here. I will tell you, it is an incredible honor to share the stage with a national hero like Sergeant Sammy Davis. To share the stage with esteemed journalists like Bob Terrell and Bill McGurn and Steve Moore. And to share the stage with TV and movie stars like Ben Stein and Donald Trump and Gary Sinise. For a geeky lawyer from Texas, this is pretty darn cool. And I have to say, having been a teenager in the 80s, I really hope this evening does not end without Ben leaning forward and simply calling out, Bueller, Bueller. I would also note that if Ben and Donald get together, they could come up with a really great TV show, Win Donald Trump's Money. Now that would get some active participants. And for any of y'all that happened to see the movie that Gary did with Mel Gibson, Ransom, he could come in and seize the money at the end. He made a very creepy bad guy. That was a great movie. Well, we're at the end of the evening, and I'll tell you I will do my very, very best to try to keep my remarks under 21 hours. But you will know I'm nearing the end when I pull out and begin to read The Cat in the Hat. Look, 21 hours is a long time. It's a really long, it's almost as long as it takes to sign up on the Obamacare website. You know, the last few weeks in Washington have been pretty quiet. At times when the battle's raging, it feels like the fights here are the center of everything. But one of the great things about kids is they remind you that what seems to be the middle of everything isn't quite all that important. Last weekend, my wife Heidi was up in town, and our girls, Caroline and Catherine, were here. Caroline's 5, Catherine's 2. And we drove down to Mount Vernon on Sunday to spend a little bit of downtime with the family. And we're driving down, and Caroline, the 5-year-old, turns to her little sister. She says, Catherine, what do you want to do when you grow up? And Catherine says, I want to work in the U.S. Senate. I want to work with Daddy. And Caroline says, oh, that's boring. We're going to be in a rock band. And then Caroline throws in the zinger, besides, Daddy will be dead by then. That was a real conversation. I have to admit, I wondered if Caroline had been speaking with Republican leadership. If she knew something I didn't know. Listen, this is a room full of the conservative intelligentsia, a term those in Washington consider an oxymoron. So what I want to do is have a little bit of reflection, some moments of reflection on Obamacare, on growth, and on tactics. I want to start by just asking a question. As conservatives, as Republicans, should we stand for growth or should we stand for austerity? This is a good room for that question. But it's a question that, listen, Republicans have battled on. What are we about? What do we believe in? You know, there was a great profile that was written in the Weekly Standard, I apologize, Bob, by Irving Kristol, talking about Bob Bartley, and for whom this gala is named this evening. And Kristol wrote about Bartley. He said, Bob and I were allies in the debate on supply-side economics, having been converted by Bob's colleague, Jude Wanniski. The name supply side was almost certainly a mistake. It took me a couple of years to figure out what it was, although Jude explained it to me patiently more than once. It would have helped if we had simply said we were committed to the economics of growth instead of the economics of equilibrium and stability. The latter, of course, was, and to some degree still is, the economic theory of the bulk of American conservatism and of the Republican Party. So the odds of winning that debate were close to nil. But a political accident intervened. Jack Kemp, a congressman who had been campaigning in favor of capital formation as a cure for economic ills, was persuaded by Jude and Bob that supply-side economics was a superior version of his theory. And Jack had the ear of an aspiring Republican presidential candidate named Ronald Reagan. Reagan agreed that the traditional Republican strategy of saving the country from bankruptcy by cutting spending, which no Republican administration had ever succeeded in doing, while leaving the programmatic initiatives in the hands of Democrats, was self-defeating. So Reagan became a convert to supply-side economics. For a while, our only convert. But cutting tax rates turned out to be a highly popular idea. Thus, the convert converted the nation. That debate, growth versus austerity, was a debate in the 1970s that mattered, and it's a debate that matters right now. You know, I've always admired the Wall Street Journal's editorial board's mission statement that Bob Bartley embodied. The Journal's mission statement says, "We speak for free markets and free people. The principles, if you will, marked in the watershed year of 1776 by Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations." So over the past century and into the next, the Journal stands for free trade and sound money, against confiscatory taxation and ukes of kings and other collectivists, and for individual autonomy against dictators, bullies, and even the temper of momentary majorities. What a powerful mission statement. What a profound mission statement. And what a mission statement I would suggest that we as conservatives, we should focus our energies. You know, there's a lot of discussion now about a grand bargain. I got to say, grand bargains make me very, very nervous. Every time there's a grand bargain, it seems spending goes up, debt goes up, taxes go up, and the American people get left out in the cold. And let me ask, what's the impact of growth versus cutting spending? Does anyone know what the impact is on debts and deficit and tax revenue of 1% increase in GDP? 1% increase in GDP brings in over a decade, according to CBO, using modest CBO projections, $2.8 trillion in tax revenues and $3.1 trillion in deficit and debt reduction. That's 1%. Does anyone in this room think there's anything the federal government could do to simplify the tax burden, to reduce the regulatory burden, to get 1 stinking percent more? That's a technical economic term, 1 stinking percent of GDP growth. By comparison, the sequester, which all of official Washington beats their chests as the greatest achievement of Republican policies in the last decades. Sequester cut spending 2.4%, was $1.2 trillion over 10 years. That pales next to the $3.1 trillion that would come from 1% of growth. I'm going to tell you my view, which is I think we ought to be relentlessly, tirelessly, exclusively focused on growth. Because every other priority we have depends on growth. If you want to turn around unemployment, you need growth. If you want to turn around the deficit and the debt, you got to have growth. If you want to save Social Security and Medicare going forward, you got to have growth. If you want to maintain the strongest military in the world to protect our national security, you've got to have growth. You know, you look at our standing in the world right now. President Putin from Russia writes an editorial in the New York Times warning against American exceptionalism. Look, I actually admit, Putin was right. Autocratic dictators have every reason to be concerned about American exceptionalism. It has not worked out well for dictators and tyrants when the American people focus on our exceptionalism. You've got China in recent weeks, their official news agency, putting out the need to de-Americanize the world. All of that is a result of feckless leadership and the lack of growth, the lack of the economic strength. Look, how did Reagan win the Cold War? He won the Cold War, number one, by standing up to the Soviet Union, but number two, by unleashing economic growth that bankrupted the Soviet Union when they tried to keep up with us. When our economy is moving, no one can keep up with us. So I'm going to submit to you our first priority should be growth. You know, I remember a conversation I had with a Republican senator in the cloakroom. And this was before the shutdown had happened, and he was talking about, he said, and this is a good guy, but he said, the most important thing we've done is sequestration. We must defend sequestration at all costs. What you're talking about doing fighting Obamacare, that's crazy. But we got to defend sequestration. And I asked, I said, okay, so you think you would vote against any continuing resolution that busts the sequestration caps? Oh, yeah. Okay, so you agree with the tactic of using the continuing resolution as leverage to actually get this done? Absolutely. You're willing to risk a government shutdown over it? You betcha. And I suggested, I said, you know what, we ought to sit down and talk. We're apparently both talking about the same tactic. We ought to talk about which has a better impact, a bigger impact on the American people. Preserving 2.4% cuts in spending, which was good, or stopping the number one job killer in this country that is Obamacare. We ought to compare them both. And I remember this senator, he said, well, the American people are with us on sequestration. I looked at him and said, which American people are those? Look, sequestration sounds like an exotic wildlife disease. Nobody has any idea what the heck it is. So that's the second thing I want to talk about. Should we have fought this fight? Now, this is a room in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of people who are living in this cauldron of debate, all of these voices saying this was a terrible, terrible fight. Indeed, there are a few people in this room who have expressed those sentiments. It's interesting, if you ask that question, should we have fought this fight, just about anywhere in the country other than Washington, D.C., the room immediately bursts out with an answer. If you get out of Washington, there's no ambiguity on this question. So what I want to talk about is, in terms of should we fought this fight, I want to talk about the merits of Obamacare. This thing isn't working. It is a disaster, and it's a disaster that is hurting people right now. You know, I spent a lot of time traveling Texas, traveling the country, doing roundtables, doing town halls, just listening to people. We just did a roundtable in Fort Worth 2 days ago, listening to small business owners there. Did one in Kerrville about 2 months ago, a little town in central Texas, about 20 small business owners. They're all sitting around the table, and I did what I often do. I said, look, let's go around the table, and each of you share an issue that's on your heart. Share an issue that you're worried about, that you're praying about, that you're thinking about. So no guidance on what the topic was. One after the other, each of the small business owners went around and said, the single biggest obstacle my business is facing is Obamacare. One after the other, the fellow in whose restaurant we were meeting, he said, listen, I've got a great opportunity to expand this business. Double the size of the business, hire new people. We've got between 30 and 40 employees. If we expand, we break the threshold of 50 employees. We're subject to Obamacare. And that'll drive us out of business. So you know what? We're not expanding. We are not hiring. 4 or 5 of the small business owners going around the table said the same thing. They were between 30 and 40 employees, and they had decided not to expand, not to hire new people. Think of all the millions of small businesses across this country that are making that same decision right now. 2/3 of all new jobs in our economy come from small businesses, and they're making that decision all over the country to stay at 30 and 40 employees and not cross the 50-employee threshold. Another woman who owned a number of fast food franchises, fried chicken restaurants. She described how she has already forcibly reduced every one of her employees to 29 hours a week. And she started tearing up. She said, listen, these people have been with us 10, 20 years. These are single moms. These are people who are struggling. They can't feed their kids on 29 hours a week. But she said, you know what? They can't feed their kids if we go out of business either. Another fellow who makes hunting blinds. It is Texas, after all. He described how he has moved his manufacturing overseas to China. He said, listen, I want to manufacture here in the United States, here in Texas, 150 to 200 good manufacturing jobs. But if we have them here, they're subject to Obamacare, and I can't be competitive in the marketplace. That is happening all over the country. On the merits, Obamacare isn't working. How many of y'all know the Nigerian email scammers? You know, if you've noticed, they've been pretty quiet lately. They've all been hired to run the Obamacare website. Although I have to note, look, if President Obama really wanted the website to work and to capture people's personal information, he should have just given it to the NSA to do. This thing isn't working on the substance. So how could we have won? How could we have won? You know, Donald Trump talked about, what on earth is wrong with you people? I'm paraphrasing slightly. But listen, Republicans in Washington apparently don't know how to negotiate. What was the plan? What was the strategy? I'll tell you, it was a four-stage plan. Stage 1 was energize the grassroots. Go and make the case to the American people. A number of us spent all of August, all of September, traveling the country, making the case to the American people that Obamacare isn't working and we should stand up and stop it. Over 2 million Americans signed a national petition at don'tfundit.com in just a matter of weeks, and they lit up the phones, melting the phone lines down to Capitol Hill. That was extraordinary. Now, stage 2 was for the House of Representatives to stand up and lead. And I'll tell you, the House demonstrated a profile in courage, listening to the American people. Now, let me point out, official Washington thought both of those stages were ludicrous. I mean, we had meeting after meeting internally in the Senate conference, and people said there's no way the grassroots will get mobilized, there's no way the American people will get mobilized, and besides that, there's no way on earth the House is going to vote to fund government and defund Obamacare. We saw both of those happen. Stage 3 was for Senate Republicans to unite and support House Republicans. And stage 4 was to start picking off red state Democrats. And that's how you do what Donald just said. You cut a deal and you make real progress for the American people if Republicans are united. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, Senate Republicans didn't unite, didn't support House Republicans. Instead, a lot of Senate Republicans actively, vigorously, vocally attacked House Republicans, attacked those who were leading the effort to stop Obamacare. And that ensured the strategy could not succeed. But you know, it's interesting. Again, this is a room of the conservative intelligentsia. Everyone in this room has heard, it's just a disagreement over tactics. We dislike Obamacare. Who diggity we do. But we just don't like this tactic. And I'm going to suggest to you, in my view, that is complete hogwash. In meeting after meeting with Senate Republicans, all through the spring, we had conversations. We said, look, Obamacare is being implemented. This thing isn't working. People are hurting. What is the plan to do something about it? And over again, the response was crickets chirping. There was no plan. Anyone who says this is a disagreement over tactics, the immediate next question should be, great! What is your tactic to stop Obamacare? Because everyone who says that, they don't have a tactic. Now let's talk about the three most common responses given for what should have been done. One response that's given is, well, this thing's so bad, it's just going to collapse on its own. It's going to collapse on its own weight. We stay out of the way, it's going to collapse, it'll be done. Now listen, on some level that's right. This thing is collapsing, but there is a reason why President Obama and Harry Reid both say Obamacare is designed inevitably to lead to single-payer socialized government health care. Because when it collapses, it's designed to destroy the private health insurance market at the same time. And once that happens, you can't unscramble those eggs. You've got over 200 million Americans who like their health insurance right now. And the strategy of, well, let's do nothing, let's let it all collapse, let's let it all melt down, jeopardizes the health insurance of all of those Americans who like their coverage. And once it's broken, putting it back is practically impossible, which is why, look, this is not, no one in here is wearing a tinfoil hat. I left mine in the car. This is what they say. If you listen to Harry Reid and President Obama, they tell you this is designed to lead to single payer. Now, how is it possibly a responsible strategy to say, well, let's sit back and wait and let the entire private health insurance market be decimated and destroyed? I don't think that's a strategy that makes any sense at all. Now, the second variant of this is, well, the problem is you nutters went too far. You shouldn't have gone for defunding. You should have gone for something less. There are lots of variants of that argument you hear. If only you'd gone for delay. If only you'd gone for something else. Well, the nice thing is, we don't have to speculate because that option has been beta tested. Unlike the Obamacare website, that option has been beta tested. Because we saw the first time the House of Representatives voted, they voted to fund the federal government and not to fund Obamacare. The bill went to the Senate. Harry Reid and the Democrats said, we will not talk, we will not negotiate. They voted it down. And the House immediately began to compromise, to find a reasonable solution in the middle. So the second time the House voted to delay Obamacare for 1 year. They said, listen, the president has delayed it for big business for a year. It's only right that we give the same treatment to hardworking American families. Now, I would note, lots of the commentators said the mistake was you didn't go to delay. Well, in 24 hours, we were at delay. What happened? It went to the Senate. Harry Reid and the Democrats said, we will not talk, we will not negotiate, we will not compromise, and voted it down. And then the House compromised a second time, again trying to find a reasonable middle ground. They said, okay, how about if we just delay the individual mandate and at the same time revoke the congressional exemption that the president illegally put in place? Now listen, in the spectrum of compromise, delay is a big compromise from defunding, and delaying just the mandate and revoking the congressional exemption is a huge compromise from delay and defunding. What happened? It went to the Senate. Harry Reid and the Democrats said, we will not talk, we will not compromise, and voted it down. And they shut the government down. So for everyone who says, well, you should have tried smaller. You know, Donald talked about negotiations. It's a funny thing. Republicans in Washington seem to think if you want to end up here, you make your opening offer right here. Anyone living on the planet Earth knows that if you have one offer here and one offer here, that if you stand together, you negotiate to something that is somewhere in the reasonable middle, And there was a tremendous opportunity. Look, I think if everything played out perfectly, I believe we could have and can still defund Obamacare. But that took everything playing out perfectly. There were lots of scenarios where the outcome was a middle ground that provided some significant relief for the millions of Americans who are suffering and hurting because of Obamacare. And if Republicans had simply stood together, if we hadn't had half of the Senate Republican Conference going on television on a daily basis, dive-bombing the House Republicans, we could have ended up with that outcome. Now, I still think what we've accomplished has been incredible. We have, number one, elevated the national debate of the harms of Obamacare and elevated it powerfully. I don't know how many of y'all saw the season premiere of Saturday Night Live. Began with a 3-minute skit on what a disaster Obamacare is. Kathleen Sebelius was on Jon Stewart's show. He ripped her limb from limb. You know, everyone is saying there was no way on earth the president would have been willing to delay Obamacare as part of the negotiations to keep the government open. Well, just an hour ago, NBC News now reports that the president's saying they're going to delay Obamacare for at least 6 weeks, the individual mandate. Now, mind you, Washington said just a few minutes ago, it's impossible, will never happen, until it does. But not only did we elevate the debate, we energized the grassroots. We energized the American people, which is critical. We saw to see over 2 million people standing up, getting engaged. We also saw Democrats take a whole lot of stupid votes. Every Democrat in the Senate voted against eliminating the congressional exemption from Obamacare. Now, for anyone who's seen Heather's very good work in polling on that issue, over 90% of Americans disagree with the congressional exemption from Obamacare. Over 70% of Democrats say they would vote against a senator who voted to preserve the exemption that's not given to the American people. Harry Reid marched all 54 Democrats off that cliff. I guarantee you, come October of 2014, we're going to see ads in a whole lot of red states with Senate Democrats up for election. That was a stupid vote that Harry Reid made every Senate Democrat take. And finally, we demonstrated what the grassroots can do. The House of Representatives stood up and led, and they stood strong in the face of a firestorm. And I'm convinced the way we turn this country around, the answers are not going to come from Washington. They're going to come from the American people. And so this particular battle, we didn't get the policy outcome we wanted because Republicans didn't unite. But the way we're going to win the war is to keep fighting the battle. Now, the final point I want to make is, why does growth matter? The single biggest reason growth matters is growth is foundational to opportunity. For a long, long time, I've championed what I call opportunity conservatism. That every policy we think about, we talk about, should focus like a laser on those who are struggling to climb the economic ladder. That we should look with a Rawlsian lens to the least off among us. How does it expand opportunity? How does it ease the means to achieve the American dream? Here's the dirty little secret the media will never tell you. Under President Obama, the rich are doing just great. Do you know the top 1%, the evil millionaires and billionaires the president likes to talk about all the time? Do you know the top 1% have a higher share of our income than at any time since 1928? Under President Obama, the Obama economy, listen, those who have already made it do fine. The people who are the losers under the Obama economy are those who are struggling to climb the economic ladder. They're young people, they're Hispanics, they're African Americans, they're single moms. They're the ones getting laid off from their jobs. They're the ones being forced to work 29 hours a week because of Obamacare. They're the ones facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums they can't pay because of Obamacare. They're the ones right now getting notifications in the mail, your health insurance is being canceled because of Obamacare. When you hammer small businesses with $1.7 trillion in new taxes with massive regulation, the people who lose are those who are struggling. There's a lot of talk in Washington that Republicans need a, quote, rebranding. Listen, we're not selling soap. We don't need a rebranding. We need to focus our energies on those who are struggling and the policies that make it possible to achieve the American dream. I'm going to give an example. Towards the end of the debate over the shutdown, there were an awful lot of Republicans who wanted the outcome to be, let's repeal the medical devices tax. A lot of Republicans, awful lot of them. And look, medical devices tax is a terrible tax. It's anti-growth, it kills jobs, it hurts innovation. It is a stupid tax that was put in punitively because that industry didn't sit at the table and play ball on Obamacare. It ought to be repealed. Medical devices tax is also one of the very top priorities of lobbyists in this town up and down K Street. There's a reason 79 senators have already voted on record to repeal the device, Democrats and Republicans. And I'll tell you one thing I argued internally. I said, listen, if we repeal this as part of something else, a part of something bigger, great. But if the only outcome of this whole fight is that we tell the American people, you too can get relief from the harms of Obamacare, if only you have tens of millions of dollars to hire lobbyists on K Street. What a terrible message. The United States Senate is closed. I'm going to suggest a test for every one of us, which is the single mom test. Does the outcome dealing with this fight over Obamacare affect the single mom who is waiting tables right now, who is struggling? Listen, in my family, both of my aunts were single moms. My sister was a single mom. People are struggling, and right now, they're the ones losing. As Republicans, they're the ones we ought to be focusing on. Generating an environment where you have economic growth, where you have robust small businesses, where people can stand on their own feet. You know, I think of it from the perspective of my father, who 55 years ago when he came from Cuba had nothing, washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. If my dad had been here now, he would have had his hours reduced to 29 hours a week. That's who we need to be fighting for. That's why growth matters. That's what this fight was about. And I'll tell you, even though we didn't win this immediate battle, I think we demonstrated the incredible power of the grassroots, the American people, and that is the path to pulling this country back from the fiscal and economic cliff at which we find ourselves. Right now reminds me very, very much of the late 1970s when we had terrible economic conditions, out of control taxes and spending, no economic growth, a feckless foreign policy. And what it took to turn this country around was the Reagan Revolution that a lot of the men and women in this room bear the scars from fighting. A grassroots revolution across this country, the American people standing up and saying there is another way. We can get back to our free market principles, our constitutional principles that are the foundation of this nation. That's what we need to do. That's what Bob Bartley argued so passionately for on the pages of the Journal. It's what Bob Terrell has fought for so many years, and it's what every one of us is here today because we believe in freedom, we believe in the power of free markets, and we understand that freedom works. It's the greatest engine of prosperity and opportunity the world's ever seen. Thank you, and God bless you.